In the early 20th century, in a fictional setting of a small yet prosperous Greek village under the Ottoman rule, an Easter celebration is taking place. The Ottoman chief of the village, also known as Aga, is sitting at a local tavern and taking shots. Meanwhile, the Christian elders of the village are gathering after the celebration for a meeting where they will plan for the next year's Easter. Next year's Easter is going to be special. They are going to hold a reenactment of the crucifixion of Jesus. And the twist is that the play will be done by the villagers themselves. So the 5 village elders select 5 characters who will play the following roles. A shepherd and a former monk will play Jesus. A local villain is cast as Judas. 3 other villagers are cast as apostles, James, John, and Peter. And an extra role is saved for a woman in the village. This woman is a widow and a prostitute, and she is assigned as the only female character to play the role of Mary Magdalene. The villagers who have been assigned the roles cannot say no to them. And there is an added element of an extended preparation for the part, meaning that not only are they to prepare before the very performance, the people who have been cast for the play need to live up to the ideals of the characters they've been assigned to play for the entire year. This is the basic setting of the novel called Christ Recrucified by Nikos Kazantzakis, a Greek author that you may know because he wrote the novel Zorba the Greek. This novel is quite abundant with characters, and all of the characters are kind of presented in the first 2 chapters, which felt a bit overwhelming when I started to read it. So in order to navigate the story better and to gain some clarity, I decided to form a sort of a chart that we will go through together so that everybody has a clear picture of who the characters of this novel are and what are their roles. Now, at the top of the chart, we have the Ottoman chief, Aga of Likovrisi, who obviously has a guard and a slave. The guard is also Turkish, and the slave is a Christian woman. Now note that he also has 2 quote-unquote boys that he entertains in his chambers. These are not exactly his children, but rather young boys he embraced under his protection, whose role is to hang out with him in his chambers, far away from the public eye. On the left-hand side, we have the 5 village elders. 3 of them are extra important, the high priest being the first, otherwise known as Pope Grigoris. He has a daughter called Mariore, and she's engaged to another elder's son. Now, the other elder has a name that I can barely pronounce, so I'm just going to call him George, and his son's name is Michaelis. Now, George is a Christian chief of the village, otherwise known as the Archon, and as every good, wealthy Christian, he also has another illegitimate child by his maid. This is a daughter called Elenio, who he has so benevolently adopted and betrothed to one of his servants, the aforementioned shepherd called Manolius, who's going to play Jesus. The last really important elder is Father Ladas, the richest man of the village, who lives with his wife Penelope. Now, they basically live like beggars because Ladas is too cheap to spend money even on the most basic stuff. The 2 of them actually did have a child, an unnamed daughter, who died because when she fell ill, her father was too cheap to send for a doctor. Now, on the right-hand side, we have the previously mentioned villagers who have been selected by the elders to play in the reenactment. So Manolius, as we've mentioned, is a shepherd, Panayotaros is a saddler, Michaelis is the son of George, Kostandis is the local tavern owner, Yanakos is the mailman, and then finally we have Katerina, the widow, the prostitute, and quite unfairly, the bearer of shame in the village. And in the middle of the chart, we find a list of less relevant characters that still do make an appearance. Now, finally, at the bottom of the chart, we have Pope Fotis and a group of refugees which unexpectedly visits Likovrici because they have been escaping and running away from Ottoman forces elsewhere in Greece and are now seeking shelter in the village. And now for the really fun part. We're going to examine how these characters treat the roles that they were assigned. So if we look at Manolius, who was assigned the role of Jesus, and the other three villagers that were assigned to play apostles, they all kind of take this very seriously and retreat together and engage in a conversation and a reflection of how are they supposed to now embody and live up to the ideals that these roles impose on them. On the other side, in contrast, if we look at the character of Panayotaros, who needs to play Judas, he is a character that is kind of denied the character arc, the growth, the transformation, because he's already a local villain who is only even more oppressed into being the main villain. There's a very interesting part in the book when he is assigned a role where the main priest, I believe, or one of the elders, they tell him that he shouldn't judge them for giving him the role of Judas, that he shouldn't hate them because Judas is actually instrumental. He's the crucial ingredient to the reenactment of the crucifixion, because without Judas, there is no betrayal, and without the betrayal, there is no crucifixion. So they are trying to give him a sense of importance, despite the fact that they are literally legitimizing or validating that he is the worst of his kind. However, he takes it so badly that he actually only gets exponentially worse. He spirals off as a character. In the end, we have Katerina, the widow and the prostitute, who receives the news that she has been assigned the role of Mary Magdalene, as she didn't get to attend the meeting and get the news herself firsthand. I am assuming because she's a woman and it was a meeting of the elders and pretty much only men. But she gets the news afterwards and she is kind of neither surprised nor angry about it. She takes it very naturally. And if I remember correctly, I think she even has a moment where she says something like, "I've been playing that role all my life." She kind of continues being herself and shows herself as Mary Magdalene throughout the book in her own character, not because she wants to embody the role, but because that's just who she is. In that way, we kind of have three parts. We have characters that will, to a certain extent, transform their personalities to live up to the ideals. We have a character who will not undergo transformation because he will get even validated in his worst ideas of himself. And then we can have someone who did not need the role to be assigned, and that role plays no importance in her life and her view of herself, because she's just going through life as she is. So when refugees come to the village and they seek shelter and they seek mercy, unsurprisingly, since this is a wealthy village, the rich dislike the poor, and they feel threatened by the idea that they might have to give up something of their own to help others. Led by their high priest, the Pope Gregorius, they accuse the refugees of carrying infectious diseases, and they actually banish them from the village because of it. Surprisingly, on the other hand, the only people who actually do want to help turn out to be people who have been assigned to play the apostles and Jesus. Aside from them, Katerina, the widow, also offers help. She has this beautiful shawl that she wears all the time. That's kind of, I think it has some kind of red flowers on it or something like that. And she offers that shawl to one of the victims, gives it up for them to have to cover themselves and to not be cold. However, if I would look at how the novel is written, I do feel like throughout the novel, even though Katerina does help in significant ways, not only by offering her shawl, but also the apostles will help the refugees find refuge since they cannot stay in the village, the nearby mountain, Mount Sarakina. And they will offer them their help with getting the food from the village to them and getting them some supplies. Katerina is participating in all this. She also goes there to give them food. But I do feel like throughout the novel, her role in doing this is kind of underplayed. What's more accentuated is the role she has in the lives of men, particularly Panayotoros, who plays Judas, and Manolios, who plays Jesus, because they are both, in a certain sense, attracted by her, but they both have a problem with it. Judas will take it out on her in a violent way, and Manolios will perceive it as this grave sin that he has on himself. I personally interpret this as a reflection of how the society of that time viewed women as Katerina, capable of doing something good, yet morally apprehensible, guilty of other men's adultery. They perceive her as the villain. She is at fault for attracting them rather than them taking responsibility for how they act in their lives. She kind of represents this nexus of all these conflicted emotions in these so-called good Christians who at the same time both desire and abhor her. And this is where it gets truly interesting, because playing roles is not something that's temporary in these villagers' lives. What we see from the novel is that they are all playing certain roles constantly in the society, regardless of the play of the crucifixion of Christ. So we see them all acting a certain way. We see them all acting as good Christians, for example, but they only do so until life actually puts them to the test and gives them a chance to show how good they really are. So we see that it's more of a performance than it is a true value that they live according to. I also feel like Katerina's character is particularly interesting here because while she does take very naturally the role of Mary Magdalene, as in that's who she is, she does identify and play this role of the village prostitute, and in a sense that she takes on herself this shameful role of the village whore who bears on herself, on her own conscience, the burden of other men, while in reality, who she is just a sin-free sex worker, a woman who is now on her own and who is capable of providing for herself. Another character is very good at pretense, and that's the character of Aga. So kind of like the Christians, he also pretends to be a good Muslim, but through certain details we see that his faith too is to a certain extent symbolic. So for example, he doesn't really embody all the core values through his actions, and also he does things that very directly contradicts what he is allowed or not allowed to do as a Muslim. So for example, he cuts a deal with his slave. They make an arrangement where she will bring him pork sausages that he actually loves to eat, but lie to him that they are made of camel meat. And her saying these are camel meat sausages is kind of a code for I got you the good stuff. On the other hand, considering his two pretty boys that he entertains in his chambers far away from the public's eye, the pork sausages don't seem as relevant in terms of sinning, but that will be a chapter on its own. What is interesting here is that the only characters who are actually trying to do good are the ones that have been assigned formal roles. And I think it has something to do with the proximity of being instructed to do it by somebody in a position of power, such as the Pope or the Archon or Aga. Now, the Pope, Archon, and Aga are also people who have been assigned from the place of formal institutions certain roles to play, and they have responsibilities according to their respective religions. But what the author successfully does here is point out how badly religion, power, and money mix. Because these are people like Aga, Archon, and the priest. They are people who have been in these roles, in these formally assigned roles, for a really, really long time. And they've not only accumulated responsibilities, but they've accumulated privileges. They have been in positions of power, and they are wealthy, or at the very least, comfortable. What happens is that now, because fulfilling or living up to the values of Christianity would mean potentially losing some of those privileges, they hold on to those formal roles more in that symbolic sense. They're doing it pro forma. They're doing it to show symbolically that they represent certain institutions and certain concepts, but they aren't really embodying the values that lie at the core of it. I feel like the author is consistently questioning the firmness or the quality of their faith in the values they're supposed to stand for. They are presented as corrupted by greed, by money, by power, and they are, in fact, performing their roles as believers, while in reality living out who they truly are behind closed doors. Another element of this book that I found very captivating and very well portrayed is hierarchy. Social hierarchies are explored in various situations in between all characters in very different constellations of characters. And while you can understand that some of these hierarchies that exist, some of which are formal, some of which are less formal or social conventions, not really codified by law, all of them can be treated as a byproduct of the historical context when all of this is happening. So the famous argument of, oh, back in the day, that's how things were. But the author has a very skillful way of approaching it, because while he presents you with these situations that were just considered normal once upon a time, at the same time, he makes you feel a certain level of discomfort, a certain level of hypocrisy in everything that's happening, so that you can sense the wrongness of what is going on in the scene. Now, one of the most typical examples of hierarchies that's explored in the book is the master and servant one. So masters and servant in a formal setting exist both in a sense that, for example, Aga owns a slave, a Christian slave woman. The Archon, George, owns a servant. His servant is not exactly his slave, but he is quite disempowered while in his service, I would say, but he's not formally treated as a slave. And the way Archon treats his servant or his shepherd Manolios is almost with a sense of benevolence towards him. He appreciates him in certain ways, but he very clearly perceives him as someone of a lower caste than what he is. It's a similar thing with Aga and his boys that he entertains in his chambers. So these boys are minors. The way I read it, while their age is not specified concretely, they are quite young, and that's the whole point of why he wants them. And while he does show affection for them, it is very clear that they have one particular purpose, which is to bring him pleasure. The second type of hierarchy I've seen is the one that is between parents, so parents and children specifically. So we have a difference between how the Grand Archon treats his legitimate son and how he treats his illegitimate daughter, who I think, personally, that the book implies he also abused, potentially even sexually. I am not perfectly sure and do not want to claim this, but I feel like certain insinuations have been made. However, she is absolutely treated as a servant in the house. The way he talks to her, he talks down to her, whereas when he talks to his son, he is full of hopes, he's full of expectations. He feels very benevolent for even adopting the illegitimate daughter, even though she is his child, and feels like he is being this benefactor that's going to make it possible for her to marry his servant. So he's positioning everybody according to this maybe not so formal, but this conventional set of rules that existed in that day's society. And this gets very interesting throughout the book because his son is the one who will rebel against his father. And this moment of rebellion is excellent. There is a scene, and it happens when the refugees come to the village, and the villagers are terrified because now there are all these unknown people coming. They're begging for mercy. You're kind of feeling compassion for them, but at the same time, you feel like they want to take what's yours. The Pope is saying that they carry infectious disease. You feel like, no, now I'm scared of them. And in the midst of all that, Michaelis, who is the son of the Grand Archon, he talks to Manolius, who is their servant. And it is very interesting because they have just been assigned those roles to play of the Jesus and the Apostle. And Manolius realizes that this is the moment to show your compassion, your Christianity. And he starts standing up to Michaelis in a sense that he starts speaking to him and telling him, you need to go and get food supplies from your father's house. He has a lot. He's asleep. You will not wake him. We must go. We must get it. And we must help these poor people to have something because they have nothing. And Michaelis has this moment of reflection in that scene, in that particular interaction where he says, this man is my servant, and he's suddenly speaking to me as if we're equals. How can he speak to me like that? The brilliant thing is that at that point, Michaelis has reflected on the fact that he needs to act as if an apostle would have acted. And he starts thinking, well, while I dislike this rebellious act of my servant speaking to me as I'm an equal, at the same time, what he says feels very right. They have precisely witnessed like a huge group of people starving for days on end, coming, seeking shelter, seeking sanctuary, seeking mercy. A woman, once the refugees arrive, collapses and falls dead on the ground in front of them. And you can see Michaelis clearly affected by all this and feeling very clearly that now is the time to show who you are. But this moment of reflection between him and Manolius was really beautiful, and Michaelis actually succumbs. He does what Manolius tells him. He goes and he takes his father's supplies and he brings them to the refugees once they take refuge in Mount Sarakina, and he feels very good about it. And Michaelis is probably the character that has the biggest transformation in that sense. Manolius will also have a transformation, but not so much. But Michaelis really goes from somebody who has been very subservient, very kind of a law-abiding citizen, or somebody who follows the tradition, follows the norms, respects the hierarchies. He will go from that to a person who at the end of the book will be a suspected communist, amongst other things. So it is a very, very interesting commentary on things. There is an element of political hierarchies as well in the book, in terms of political oppression. It is not explored so much in depth. It is a position where the Ottoman forces are colonizing Greece, and this is a colonized village. This is a village where, while they have their own social structure and they have their grand archon and pope and everything, the highest power of the village still lies with the Ottoman ruler, and that is Aga. And midway through the book, that is very clearly depicted, that if something goes wrong and if Aga is enraged, everything else becomes irrelevant. And what happens in the middle of the book is that one night, the first of Aga's two boys, called Yusufaki, he's found dead. He's found killed, and Aga throws a fit of rage. He does not know who killed him, but he is convinced that it must be one of the villagers. It must be one of the Christians, because he is the one who rules over them, and he interprets it without any proof or any knowledge as an act of rebellion against him, against the formal power of the village. And he throws a huge fit of rage and threatens that unless the person who did it comes forward themselves, he will start hanging people, regular villagers, whoever, at a tree or on a tree in the middle of the village, to demonstrate to what extent he can cause harmful consequences if anybody dares to rebel. And this is where, unfortunately, Caterina's story ends, because at first, in the act of living up to his role, Manolios tries to take the sin upon himself. Even though he didn't do it, he goes and he chooses in a Jesus-like manner to say, I will take the sins of the villagers on me. I have killed him. It's just how it's been. And the Aga accepts it, and he says, all right, then we shall hang you, and we shall hang you in the public square. And he throws him in the cell, and he throws even the elders and throws them in prison. And the elders in prison are also a comical situation in themselves. When Manolios admits, he lets them go and he plans to hang Manolios. However, the widow Caterina, who is a metaphorical Mary Magdalene, she comes and she says that it was her and sacrifices herself in order to save Manolios. And the Aga kills her in a very brutal public way, which is absolutely devastating to read. This is just one glimpse of what these hierarchies look like and how they are depicted. And since I said that hierarchies are all about power, it is very interesting from the point of view of refugees who settle in Mount Sarakina as well, how they go from completely powerless to actually feeling empowered anew, because they are getting assistance from these villagers who are supposed to be apostles, and Manolios, who's supposed to play Judas, because they keep actively helping them. And this compassion gives them a new sense of hope. It gives them a new motivation to try and rebuild themselves. However, and this is kind of a subversive property of power, what happens is that once they really feel like they should fight for themselves, they shouldn't give up, because they're in a desperate position and they're literally just struggling to survive, they create their own sense of morality that to a certain extent, is based in these Christian values, as they see the villagers as villains who are greedy, lustful, selfish, arrogant, and vain. They will decide that it will be okay to try to take away from them the wealth they have accumulated, because they will reason that what they're doing is abusing power and privilege that they have, when in fact it is something that needs to be shared, which is also why they're suspected and labeled as communists towards the end of the novel. Since this is the book that deals a lot with topics of religion and faith and social norms, one big portion of it is about various forms of behavior that are not approved, in religious terms also known as sins. This book is pretty clear on the burden that behaviors considered sins can pose on the characters that engage in them. So one of the big sins in this book is related to lust. It revolves a lot around the character of Katerina, who is a prostitute and who has quite a lot of customers in the village. And one of her biggest customers is Panayotaros, who goes to her very often and is himself extremely conflicted about the fact that he does. He kind of desires her and is almost dependent on the possibility of being with her, but at the same time hates her and projects his own flaws and his own lack of the ability to control himself onto her. On the other hand, she's also an object of lust for the character who plays Jesus, for Manolios. Now, Manolios is a previous monk, and as he is no longer a monk and is employed as a servant, as a shepherd, and even engaged to his master's illegitimate daughter, he kind of has this permission now to engage in relationships with women and be able to start a family with somebody, marry. But when he is assigned the role of Jesus, he is also extremely conflicted within him, because he realizes that he has this huge lust, not so much for his fiancée, who he respects and admires a lot, and he has a lot of affection for her, but it seems to be more of a platonic affection, not really something based in passion. On the other hand, he does start to lust extremely for the widow, and as he is aware of that lust, that comes into conflict with his need to live up to the ideal of acting and behaving the way Jesus would. And that those two don't go together. So he has, and this is brilliant, it was such a funny episode in the book, because there is this scene where he experiences this very strong lust, and he struggles with it, and there is this internal monologue and internal struggle what to do, and then he decides to go to her house, and he kind of, I think, on some internal level succumbs to his desire. And as he's on his way to her, he's like excited about what is happening, and he's kind of in disbelief over what he is doing. And then on the way there, he starts describing these changes happening in his body, all of these like signals that it's sending him. And you can see that a part of it is because he's doing something that he's not supposed to be doing, but it gets so intense that at one point I just interpreted it as if he was having a massive hard-on. But then it turned out it was not a hard-on. In fact, his head began pulsing in this really weird way. And I was like, okay, maybe, I don't know. And then a few paragraphs later, it turned out that not only was it not a hard-on, he actually had something similar to leprosy. It almost felt like divine intervention where he was punished, but it was like a blessing in disguise because it was a disease that struck him at the moment of his utmost weakness, and it made him feel like, oh my God, I cannot go there looking like this, which is a perfectly legitimate feeling. And he turned around and went back to his shed. Then he has a conversation with Pope Fotis, the Pope that leads the refugees. And in that moment, he realizes that what he needs to do, and this is a classical, I believe, religious or Christian idea, that you need to confess your sins. And he confesses everything. He confesses the weakness of his body, the weakness of his spirit, the fact that he was ready to succumb to it and to go and do the forbidden act, and explains that this leprosy, let's say, struck him in the last moment, and kind of frames that in a way that it's actually good. It's a temptation that he had, and God had sent him a challenge to overcome and to prevent him from committing this cardinal sin of fornication with a woman. It depicts all these very strong social norms around the idea of having sex, especially when you come at it from a religious point of view. This idea of sinning and confessing will come in other episodes of the book as well. There is a chapter where not only he confesses, but also Pope Fotis confesses to him, and I believe Michaelis, who is there at the same time. And that is a more disturbing confession, because he tells his very long life story, and he tells how he fell in love with a girl that was not of his religion, who was Jewish, and how his father had given him up because of that. And then he says that he was so infatuated with this girl, with this woman, that once when she kind of on a dare asked him to kill a man, he actually went on and did that. After that, he kind of ended up going into the religious waters and finding his absolution through faith. There also you can see it kind of presents all these feelings of lust and desire mixed with romantic feelings of love as something that's potentially dangerous and toxic, and that pushes you into being the person that you don't want to be. Obviously, I interpret this more as kind of a critical reflection on how religion can distort our views of what love is and what desire is. It's meant to get us thinking about the displacement of our own flaws in our behavior and impulse control into this one particular area of life. Because I don't really think that anybody is capable of killing another person simply because they fell in love with someone. If you have that capacity, then that's probably something that was in you way before, and it's probably something that maybe that situation simply triggered in one way or another, but it's definitely not the cause. And I think that that's what the characters maybe can't see. But there is a very puritanical relationship towards love and sex and religion, and these characters all suffer immensely because of it. Even Panayotaros, who actively sins, and he does it aware that he is sinning. He does it completely giving in to his worst impulses. He himself perceives it as his worst impulses. And when he goes to Katerina, he feels guilt afterwards and he feels shame, but he can't resist his impulses. Yet he displaces that into the idea that she is a beautiful woman that's attracting him. The areas of sex and love and religion become sort of scapegoats to explain personal flaws that are probably rooted in something entirely else that people don't have the capacity to understand at that point in time. What I did find progressive, despite all these things, is the way that Katerina is treated, considering that she sells sexual services in the village. Because I do feel like the author never placed any blame or shame actively on her on the very fact that she does this. It is very clear that he's depicting that the shame and the blame come from the men around her. They come from the social conventions, the norms that exist in the society, but he never actually judges her. I really appreciated that. I really liked that. I think it's very easy to take a different road and kind of implicitly judge women who engage in sex work. And I like that. And I like that I never got the impression that she herself perceives herself as a bad person or a sinner in any way, shape, or form in the novel. And I think that's really something to applaud the author for. Now, there are other sins that are also a part of this book. One big part of it is greed. Greed is treated mostly through the characters of the elders, specifically the three elders who are most important, Pope Grigoris, George, or the Grand Archon, and Old Father Ladas. And Father Ladas, he is kind of the most extreme example of that. If you remember, that is the person who is too cheap to call a doctor on his own sick child. His child passes away. Father Ladas is really made a caricature almost in the book, I would say. And there is this very strong image of his wife, Penelope, who is presented as completely mummified, I feel. She's always barefoot. I think the message is that they do not believe in spending money on shoes. She's always barefoot and she's always sitting and knitting constantly. And I interpreted it as a response to the fact that they've lost their child the way that they did. I think that Penelope is somewhere deep inside very aware that one sin there led to another. And the irony of their situation is that they are so passionate, or he mostly is so passionate about money that he doesn't really use for anything. On the other hand, the Archon and Pope are a bit different, I would say. They are not as extreme in their accumulation of wealth, but they are extremely selfish in what they have. They have more than enough, but they are not willing to share with anyone. And they feel that that is a part of the natural order, that that is just how it has to be. In a way, they've found a way to rationalize their own position of extreme privilege that is not really in the spirit of Christianity, is not in the spirit of being humble, of being modest. It is the complete opposite of that. So the last big theme that I want to address, I've named it Holy War. Now, it is not a literal crusade that is happening in the book, but it is a war in the name of faith that is the end result of all these social inequalities that surface when the refugees come to the village and when the population of the village kind of splits up between those who are willing to help and who are willing to question themselves, and those who are not and who want to remain privileged at all costs, even if they need to sacrifice a lot of others for doing that. And I called it that because what happens is that as the novel progresses and as the apostles and Manolio go and help the refugees at Mount Sarakina, they engage more and more in conversations with their Pope, and they reflect more and more on the righteousness of things, the morality of things, on what Jesus said. They read the Gospels and they start comparing what actually is written in the New Testament to how their society in fact functions. And what they notice is there are these huge differences in between. They notice this insane hypocrisy that exists amongst the elders in the village, and they see those villagers blinded with greed, with power, with money. And there is this one very traumatic moment in the book where in the beginning, when they start going there to the refugees to help them out, to bring them supplies, I think it is Michaelis who witnesses this horrifying scene where one of the refugees dies, and they want to dig a grave for the person. And they do that, and they lay the body inside. And then an older man from the village who was digging the hole and helping put the body there refuses to come out of the pit. When he's called up and when they offer him help, he lies down next to the body and says, "Bury me with it. I am at peace. I have seen enough." And I think that this scene, it leaves such a strong impression on the characters of the book that it completely changes their view of life, and it kind of strengthens this new position that they have now that they feel responsibility to act the way their faith, in fact, had intended them to. So what happens is that the apostles and Manolios are now talking to Pope Photis about not only how unjust the current situation is between the refugees and the villagers, but also it addresses this topic of people who live in such extreme circumstances and who are refused any form of mercy. It shows how in their attempts to survive that, they create stories to rationalize their strategies of survival. And at one point, this goes into the opposite direction, because these refugees, the Pope and Manolios and the three apostles, will decide that what is actually morally right is if they treat you that way and they are acting completely against the Christian faith, you have the right to go to war with them. You have the right to go and take what they don't need and don't have any more right to have than you do. They are no more human beings than you are, and they are no more deserving of the basic necessities of life that sustain us. What starts as this spiritual gathering and spiritual connection between them, it now morphs in the book into a very real political struggle. They prepare, in fact, to attack the village, to burn the house of Father Ladas, to take away or to settle in the houses and take the land and the supplies that they need. They've started rationalizing why it would be okay to go to war, even though war does mean consequences in terms of people who will die, people who will be, because not all villagers have the same power, right? We talk about the elders being the ones in control, and you're not attacking only them, you're attacking everyone, and you're taking from everyone. You know that with war, a certain amount of collateral damage comes. It happens. It causes misery and it causes a lot of pain and death and suffering to a lot of people who perhaps do not deserve it. And yet everybody gets served that. So there are really no winners in that context. Yet all of these things are now justified by the very same religion that had given them the capacity to show compassion and to help. He puts it in such an interesting political context, because when the refugees are preparing for attack and they're headed towards the village, they even have these chants that they're doing because they feel like they're an army now. And Aga is the chief of the village. He has kind of a protector role, and he does tell them that he will protect them from outsider attacks. But then when the villagers come, somebody goes and tells, wake up the Aga, tell him that they're coming, he needs to come with us, he needs to help us to fight. And the Aga has this really typical and brilliant reply, because this is how people in power think. So since Aga is a foreign occupying force, and he does hold the ultimate power, when he's informed, people tell him the communists are coming, because now in the village they started talking about how the refugees in the Sarakina and Michelis and Manolios and everyone, they have actually become communists. They have been influenced by the revolution in Russia, and they're thinking in a different way now. So this is a politically motivated attack. So somebody goes to Aga and tells him the communists are attacking, and Aga's first reaction is, oh my God, are the Russian troops here, or are they attacking the Ottoman Empire? And then they explain to him, no, the Russians aren't here. It's like we're talking about the communists at Mount Sarakina. And when he realized that, he just says, oh, well, let them fight. Who cares? Don't wake me up for bullshit like that. And that is actually really how he stays in power, right? Because this is an internal struggle now between two groups of Christians, both were oppressed by the Ottoman Empire, but he, as a representative of that empire, of that oppressing force, understands that the bigger their internal conflicts are, the more solidified his power becomes, because the more divided they are, the less likely they are to rebel against somebody who's stronger than them. Of course, the scene comes when the two groups meet, and there is a war. And there is one elder who has not been mentioned a lot in the book, or is not as protruding of a character as others, and that is the schoolmaster, the man whose name is Haji Nicholas. He is the one who tries to make peace, and he's the one who says at the last moment, let's try to do this as human beings. Let's try to talk. Let's try to create some kind of a consensus around what is going on. He doesn't really reach them in full. However, the two popes decide that in order to prevent a big carnage, the two of them should fight each other. And the first one that beats the other one down to the ground will determine which side is the victorious one. Obviously, it's also not an idea that functions, because when one of the popes starts winning, another person from the opposing group notices that they're about to lose and hops in, starts fighting, starts helping their pope. And that's when it just goes down like a snowball and just grows, and everybody goes into it. In the end, the refugees do win. They manage to get into the village. They manage to go into the houses. They manage to set fire to Lada's house. Once they win, first of all, the villagers who are still there are extremely angry, and they conspire and they kill Manolios. And this is all happening around Christmas. Manolios is killed. He is mourned, and Pope Photis, who was with the refugees, he looks at his body and he does have this reflection. It's also the chapter title of the last chapter. In vain, my Christ, in vain. And he wonders, why is everything happening like this? Because it's very clear that there are no real winners. The novel ends in an even, I want to say worse, but it's not really the word I'm looking for. Manolio's death is not the ultimate defeat. What happens after that, even, is that they hear that there are other Ottoman troops coming towards the village, and they realize that they need to keep going. They can't stay there. The novel ends by all of them, after having won this holy war that they waged on each other in the name of Christianity, both sides in their own, I would say, perverted ways, they just leave. And I love that ending because it does show how little purpose there is in this kind of conflict. And that isn't to say that this conflict wasn't a legitimate one from the beginning, because the social inequalities that caused it were very real. It is very clearly presented in the book when they are so extreme, and when people who are so extremely oppressed are reduced to this sense of complete powerlessness over their own situation, one possible response, if they do want to survive, can be going another extreme direction and straying away from what actually held them together in unity and what gave them the strength. No matter how much you try to work your way around it, justifying war with religion should not be possible, because war is really not a productive way of resolving any kind of conflict. What it causes usually are pain, suffering, and trauma that will stay with everybody who was involved for generations after. I was really pleasantly surprised by this book. I picked it up on a vacation in Greece, in Crete, which is the homeland of the author. And I basically chose it because there was literally no other book translated into the English language by a Greek author at those bookstores that I visited. So I didn't have much of a choice, but it turned out to be a great read, an excellent book, and I'm very intrigued to read more by the same author. I am absolutely impressed by his ability to condense these huge topics of politics, religion, sex, morality, all of this together into one story with a very interesting plot that I haven't heard of before. I haven't seen something similar in another book. And that's always something that I appreciate, because it gives like a fresh take on even sometimes the topics that you've seen in other works. I think that there is a special value of this book because it deals with a very particular topic that I think is still extremely relevant today, and that is what happens when religion and politics mix, or rather, when religion gets politicized and sometimes weaponized for the purposes of, for example, obtaining social justice or maintaining the current social order. And I think that if you reflect a bit on, for example, the current state of political affairs in some places in the world, for example, what's happening in Gaza, you can see that these topics still are something that's very much discussed. Now, obviously, this book and the setting and the plot and everything that's happening cannot be considered a direct comparison to anything happening in Gaza or anywhere else in the world today. But what it does provide us with is a context to which we can have a certain amount of both emotional and historical distance to think about the mechanics and the dynamics of these very complicated intersections between religion and politics. A very powerful book, a very, very nice read, not very demanding in terms of style. I've read a translation into English, so I'm only assuming that it's a similar thing in the original language, and I'm hoping that it's the same in other languages. Great book, highly recommend, and Until next time, also an apology if I have, during this video, butchered any Greek names, as Greek is not one of the languages I speak. I didn't have much of a choice. And if you haven't read Kazantzakis, I warmly recommend it, and I hope that you do. It's totally worth the time.